Als nächster Punkt auf der Tagesordnung folgt jetzt die Erklärung des Präsidenten der Kommission zur Lage der Union.
Die Europäische Union ist zurzeit nicht in Topform.
Großbritannien steht vor dem Austritt aus der Europäischen Union.
The United Kingdom will not be the last member state to leave the European Union.
On one of the deadliest migration routes in the world. On this day, they pulled out nearly 1,000 migrants.
That we need strong border control. We have to protect our borders.
They're increasingly desperate to get their hands on cash to live on.
The Greek people said no, but 18 other members of the Eurozone agreed about the proposals.
I thank Jean-Claude Juncker and I thank his whole Commission for his perfect work for Europe. Thanks so much.
We are the European People's Party. Do not let the leftists mess up and reconstruct Europe.
Aber die Europäische Union is in ihrem bestand niet gefährdet, niet gefährdet, niet gefährdet, niet gefährdet.
Het is een puinhoop nu waar we in leven. Financiële troep, bedrijven die het voor het zeggen hebben. Democratie is er niet alleen voor multinationals en banken.
Diversité, représentation des minorités, emploi, jeunesse, égalité hommes-femmes, ce sont là des questions très importantes, non seulement pour moi, mais également pour les générations européennes à venir.
I think that there should be more transparency around it. People should know it should not be the closed doors.
Some say it's a utopia to believe that things can change, but actually the utopia is to believe that things can continue going on as they are going. You have to reverse the question and ask, where do we want to go?
Moi, j'imagine une Europe où il fait bon vivre.
A Europe that works for all citizens and not just some.
Une Europe où chaque citoyen, lambda, serait respecté, serait mis en valeur.
A Europe that can foster opportunities and prosperity for all societies and not just some.
Une Europe où tout le monde trouverait sa place.
A Europe that can involve all citizens and not just some.
Une Europe pour son peuple.
Not only is another Europe possible, it is absolutely necessary. And not only do we want to construct it, we want to help others and come together with others to construct it as well.
Doe mee.
Bonsoir, Brussels. Good evening, Brussels. Welcome to the real State of the Union, brought to you by DiEM25, the Democracy in Europe movement. Our band of thousands of dreamers who came from all over Europe, joined hands across national borders, across, those entrenched, pointless party division lines in order to forge together a progressive, democratic European Union. As you know, this is the reason why we're here, in a few days from now, the President of the European Commission, the Venerable Mr. Jean-Claude Juncker, will be delivering in Strasbourg his annual State of the Union address. Undoubtedly, he's going to declare the end to Europe's crisis. Coming from the man who once famously said that when the going gets tough, politicians like him have to start lying, this simply means that the crisis is getting worse. That as we are descending into a particularly difficult moment in our history, we are effectively in a situation where our establishment is telling us that which Tacitus so beautifully captured by saying that they created a desert and they call it peace. Now, you don't have to take my word for it. Mr. Juncker is keeping his job. Indeed, Mrs. Merkel will probably keep her job in the forthcoming federal election in Germany. All the bureaucrats in the European Union are keeping their jobs because of the victory, the electoral victory of one man, Emmanuel Macron. Had he not won, Mrs. Merkel's job would be finished, Mr. Juncker would be in trouble, the European Union would be effectively disintegrating by now. Now that man the other day in Athens had this to say. He said the European Union will crumble if it is not overhauled. Notice he didn't say reformed, overhauled. Major, rebuilt. Ladies and gentlemen, either Mr. Juncker and his celebrations are justified, or Macron's warnings are valid. Either the crisis has ended, as the President of the European Commission is going to proclaim, or it is alive and kicking, ready to consume Europe, as the President of France is saying. They can't both be right. Now, of course, Mr. Juncker is continuing a long tradition of the establishment's deep denial that there is something rotten in the guts of our great realm of our Europe. And Mr. Macron, unfortunately, is making sure that the rot continues while he delivers fine speeches from in front of the Eiffel Tower or on the foot of the Acropolis, but does nothing in practice to stop the rot. Now, let's look back a little bit. Our union began in the 50s as a cartel of heavy industry. It evolved into a super technocracy whose job was to manage the cartel and keep the demos, the people, out of power, with democracy featuring just as a fig leaf to hide the oligopolistic, oligarchic nature of the European Union. Now, cartels do pretty well during the good times. They distribute monopoly or oligopoly profits amongst the national oligarchies. But when cartels go into a crisis, as they're bound to, they fall to pieces. Then, in a desperate bid to remain in control, their technocracies become more authoritarian in imposing their own failed policies. This is a dynamic that threw Europe into the morass of punitive illiberalism, which then fueled the militant parochialism of the xenophobes and the ultranationalists everywhere, not just in Britain. Greece, my home country, was but a mere symptom of all this. A state bankruptcy was turned into a permanent Great Depression so that the French, the German, and the Greek bankers would enjoy the benefits of socialism, while the weaker in our society were thrown to the dogs of the market forces. And 19 parliaments, in the meantime, were misled year after year after year. In 2015, the people of Greece rose up against their permanent depression. I remember telling the great and the good in the International Monetary Fund, in the European Central Bank, in the European Economic Commission, around governments, that if they snuffed out the Greek Spring, this brief rebellion of our people against permanent insolvency and debt bondage, this deepening crisis would produce a xenophobic, illiberal, anti-European wave, not only in Greece, but across the continent. Well, they did not listen, did they? Weeks later, they crushed our Greek Spring, ruthlessly. It was a very modern coup. European Union institutions used banks, not tanks. Unlike the coup that overthrew Greece's democracy in 1967 and the Prague Spring a year later, the usurpers wore suits and sipped mineral water in Brussels, in Frankfurt, in Berlin, in Paris, and in Athens. The very same people then had the audacity to become surprised and aghast at how populism rose up to tear the heart of Europe apart. They did not see Brexit coming. And when it did come, they responded to it with the same tactics that they used against the Greek government. And now we have ended up in a pretty ludicrous state of affairs. We have two different versions of authoritarian incompetence, one in Brussels and one in London. The European Union sends Mr. Barnier to negotiate in London without a mandate to negotiate anything that London wants. Meanwhile, in the context of fueling parochial militant behavior and attitudes, the British government, in the name of empowering the British Parliament, is giving ministers the right to transcribe themselves European Union law into British law without even consulting the British Parliament. You can't really make this up. Look, like the Bourbons, our establishment, almost everywhere in Europe, have learned nothing and they have forgotten nothing. Now, let me return for a moment to the State of the Union address that Mr. Juncker will be giving in a few days in Strasbourg. In his speech, I can even hear him say it. He'll be celebrating rising incomes, falling unemployment rates, increasing house and share prices. Make no mistake, Europe is becoming a continent in which the numbers prosper, the people suffer, and the establishment is demanding of us that we rejoice. Well, have we got news for them? We are celebrating tonight, but we are not celebrating their fake, non-existent recovery and their numbers. We're here to celebrate the growth of our movement. We are celebrating this coming together, and many such coming together, of so many people across the continent, across national borders, across the mental divides of different political parties, different predispositions, visions of the good society, of so many Democrats getting together to tell the establishment in no uncertain terms, we shall not be lulled by your hypnotic tale of a false dawn. Now, those of you from the deep periphery of Europe need not to be lectured about the dire circumstances that we are in. But we have a duty to raise the alarm with many of our friends in places like Amsterdam, Antwerp, Stuttgart, Berlin, in the surplus, richer parts of our union, who look around them, see rivers of cash, rising share and house prices, and they're therefore susceptible to the lure of the narrative of recovery. Now, let's for a second think about Germany's supposed success story. Now, Germany's huge trade surplus means that the nation, whether it likes it or not, when it has a surplus of that magnitude, must export its savings to countries that are in deficit. Now, is this a prudent thing to do for prudent Germans? When the German money that goes to these countries, to these deficit countries, inflates bubbles like the ones that burst in 2010, 2011, causing all these problems. How smart is it to rely on the money influx, the money that flows into the Frankfurt banks, to cover up the insolvencies of Deutsche Bank and all the other German banks, especially when that tsunami of capital flowing into Germany, into Frankfurt, flows because their owners, who are rich French people, Greek people, Italian people, send their money to Frankfurt because they fear that their own economies are unsustainable. And how rational is it for the German finance ministry to celebrate its budget surplus when that surplus is due to negative interest rates that Dr. Schäuble is paying to borrow money, which are firstly crashing the pension funds in Germany, and secondly, are causing the famed Swabian housewife to lose faith in the political establishment. Friends, our task today, in assessing the real state of the Union, is not to mince our words. It is to be frank about the awfulness all around, while at the same time projecting hope based on rational, realistic policy proposals. Here today, in the next two sessions, we shall discuss what must be done, and then who is going to do it, and what we should be doing. Now, of course, economics is not everything. We economists tend to think that it is, but it is not, thankfully. Along with its socio-economic integrity, Europe is losing its soul. The cynical use of the refugees' deaths at sea in the Mediterranean to deter migration into Europe is despicable, and I would say bordering on the criminal. The European Union-Turkey deal, by which Europe effectively, think of it, we effectively bribed a despotic president of Turkey to grant us the right to violate international law on refugees. We should hang our heads in shame. And this is It would be funny if it wasn't so tragic. As funny as the joke you get when you put three words together: European, migration, and policy. Put them together and you have an unfunny joke. This is why DiEM25 is busily working towards a policy agenda that includes not only the European New Deal that we will speak about, but also our plans for a particular policy on migration, on transparency, and for a constitutional assembly process to begin in 2019, leading to the drafting of a proper democratic European constitution. Now, before I leave the stage to a brilliant panel that's going to follow to discuss the real state of the Union, allow me to ask a question. Why all this emphasis on democracy? Why the D in DiEM? Look, the establishment have been telling us for a while that there is no longer a difference between left and right. Allow me to say that the reason why they are telling us this is because they want deep down, they want to convince us that there is no difference between right and wrong. They want to put it in our heads, the idea that democracy is a luxury. It's a luxury for the rich. It's a luxury for those who lend money. But it is to be denied the debtors and the weak and the poor. In the end, ladies and gentlemen, politics is about who does what to whom. And democratic politics is about ensuring that each one of us is in control of our lives and in control of what is done in our name. The slumps, the economic crisis, the negative interest rates, the ridiculously high levels of youth unemployment, they may seem to you very difficult to explain and in need of experts, economists, scientists. Nothing could be further from the truth. They're really easy to explain. All these phenomena, all these crises are the result of too much economic power in the hands of few men, and of a bureaucracy serving the interests of those few men by keeping the demos out of democracy, by ensuring, as Wolfgang Schäuble told me once, that elections should not be allowed to change anything. That's the gist of it. Everything else is details. We're not here for the details. We're here for the substance. Thank you. And we move on to the next speaker. A few words about the next speaker. Jonas Stahl is an artist, activist, philosopher, DiEMer. He's responsible for this set. He's responsible for the melting stars of the European Union in the colors of DiEM25. He has a long tradition of creating democratic spaces, and he will talk to you about this, as well as about the way by which you are going to participate by means of your mobile phone through something which we call DiEM Voice. Jonas Stahl.
Well, thank you for that beautiful introduction, and good evening to all of you. On stage, tonight I am surrounded by the stars of the European Union. But they no longer appear in their familiar colors, and they no longer stand in their familiar circle. The manifold crisis of Europe that we face today has brought the stars of Europe to change form and to change constellation. These stars carry the symbol of DiEM25, the red and orange double wedges designed by composer and DiEM25 member Brian Eno. These red wedges are changing these stars. They are creating new constructions, new symbols, symbols of a European Union in transformation, symbols of a new union in the making. the new union that we declare here tonight at the real State of the Union. I'm an artist, I'm a member of DiEM25, a member of DiEM Voice, and together with architect Paul Kuipers, designer Remco van Bladel, State of Concept in Athens, BAK voor Basis voor Actuele Kunst in Utrecht, and many more cultural workers, my team, DiEM volunteers, together we have created these artworks. And you might ask yourself, why would artists join a political movement? What does art have to do with politics at all? My answer is everything. It might be a good start for this new union to begin here in Beaux-Arts in Brussels, because if we want to change the world that we live in, we will have to imagine this change first. And the imagination is the domain of art. Today, the imagination of the European Union is taken hostage. Ultranationalists, fascists, tell us that we must leave the Union and take our countries back. And on the other hand, the bureaucratic elite and their austerity politics tell us everything must remain the same. DiEM25 aims to liberate the imagination of our union. No more remain or leave, because this is a false choice. The only alternative is a third path. The only alternative is a new union. The union of the Progressive International, a democratic union, a social union, a union that maybe now we can only imagine, but we will need to imagine it if we want to create it. On behalf of artist Danae Stratu, the founder of DiEM Voice, which is the cultural wing of DiEM25, I invite you tonight to share your questions, your imaginations on how to create this new union. So behind me, at any moment now, you will see a slide appear. Through Twitter and through email all night long, you can comment, share your questions, and these questions will be brought in front of all the different speakers and DiEM25 representatives here today. And this way, DiEM Voice aims to broaden the discussion amongst many on a stage that can only host so many. On a final note, tonight is not just any event. The European project finds itself at the crossroads today. From Hungary to Poland, we witness the overhaul of the independent judicial system and the prosecution of dissidents. In France and Austria, parties that were founded by former Nazis nearly won presidencies, and there's no reason to think that a former Nazi somehow is not a Nazi still. Across Europe, refugees flee wars that European member states have either started or contributed to. And instead of helping them, they are rejected entry and have turned the sea into a grave. In my own country, the Netherlands, although we have said never again, dit nooit meer, so many times, a racist, brute party has become the second largest of our country. This is also the real state of Europe today. And we cannot trust the austerity elite to provide a real answer, because they are part of the problem to begin with. So here, gathered at Beaux-Arts, we represent an alternative, but only if every single one of us puts our hearts and our passion and our craft and our imagination in this movement. Only if we become members and representatives and activists, we can take back our imagination. We don't need to take back our countries. Let's take back our imagination first, so that we can establish our new union. We have the plans, and we have the people to do it, from Yanis Varoufakis to Danae Stratu, from Naomi Klein to Srećko Horvat, from Lorenzo Marsili to Ada Colau. I am here to say that now you have the artists too. Thank you so much.
Good evening. My name is Joren de Wachter, and I am an Aboriginal from Brussels. I'm here to moderate and help the first part of the Real State of the Union, and I represent, or I am the voice of the Brussels DSC, the local spontaneous collective organization of DiEM25, which is a bit unfair because the other members did much more work in preparing for this than I did, and most of them are much better looking than me, but there you go. I have a slightly unusual profile for somebody who is in a progressive political movement because I'm actually a software entrepreneur and investor. I'm very much on the business side of things. And I have no political background whatsoever, never been a member of a party. But when I read the DiEM25 analysis and what I was trying to say and the voice that was bringing to the political debate, I was struck by the quality of the analysis and by how many things that are said in there are true. But as I was also struck by the approach that said that whoever wanted could become part of the voice that would give or start to give answers. And DiEM25 is pretty good in the sense that it allows people to participate in being that voice. And one of the things we did today was the workshop with the people of DiEM25. Who here was in that workshop today? Can you raise your hand? There you go, excellent. Can we please give them a big applause? They were fantastic. And this is important because we didn't have enough hands. So for those of you who didn't raise your hand, if you want to be able to raise your hand next time and get a cheer from an audience, you should join DiEM25 and join in the next meetings that we do and be part of that voice to become the future of Europe. The real state of the Union is really about the voice that we will hear next week, the voice of Jean-Claude Juncker, and the things that he will not say. Because as you know, in these kind of speeches, the things people don't say are more important than what they do say. And so tonight, one of the things that we try to do is to lift the veil a little bit of the real state of the Union and talk about some of the things that we anticipate Jean-Claude will not talk about. For that purpose, we have invited 3 excellent speakers for you. And I will ask you, in following up on the last speaker, and Jonas, to tweet your questions, because at the end of the 3 presentations, we will have a very short session of question and answer, and the more questions you send, the more we can do with them. Which gives me the pleasure of introducing the first speaker, who is Philippe Legrain. Philippe is a senior fellow at the London School of Economics European Institute. He is a founder of Open, which is an international think tank to defend and advance open societies. He is the author of many successful books. And also, he was an independent advisor and head of the strategic policy team to Barroso, the then president of the Commission. Philippe?
Thank you. As Yanis said, the Eurozone economy is doing a bit better this year. Unemployment is falling, and growth has returned even in Greece. But even with this welcome upturn, the Eurozone's economic performance over the past decade has been truly catastrophic. Most Europeans have suffered a lost decade of stagnant or falling wages. Unemployment remains scarily high in Southern Europe, especially among young people. A common currency that was meant to bring Europeans together has instead led to economic divergence and political division. Germany has got richer, and Greece has got much poorer. And some of the worst policy decisions have been corrected. or mitigated, Eurozone governments remains dysfunctional and undemocratic. As Yanis said, the misguided bank and sovereign bailouts have turned clashes between private creditors and debtors, basically the banks and those they lent to, across the Eurozone, into national conflicts between creditor governments and debtor ones. And EU institutions have become instruments for creditor governments to impose their will on debtors. Germany has been thrust into the driving seat, and it tends to act in its narrow interests as a creditor rather than in those of the Eurozone as a whole. Economic adjustment has been not just asymmetric, but one-sided. The countries that were running large current account deficits have been forced into surplus, and those that were running surpluses run ever larger ones. Wages have been driven down in the perverse pursuit of export competitiveness, beggaring our neighbors and ourselves. And a dangerously tight fiscal straitjacket has been imposed. And while Germany insists that the rules must always be obeyed, it refuses to comply with the rules on dangerous imbalances. And you've seen capital controls imposed in Cyprus and in Greece. And Greece threatened with a truly brutal Brexit. And while Mario Draghi's promise to do whatever it takes has held the euro together, it's also taken away the political pressure to actually solve the crisis. So an acute crisis has become a chronic one. And the tragedy is that as a result of all this, the political capital of the European project, built up over decades, has been greatly eroded in just a few years. Animosity among Europeans has soared. New grievances have been created and old stereotypes revived. And there's a burning sense of injustice, that policymakers are incompetent, unaccountable, self-serving, and even corrupt. And all of that feeds into nationalist and xenophobic sentiment that is destroying Europe. So this German-dominated, creditor-run, fiscally austere, and deflationary Eurozone is undesirable, undemocratic, and ultimately unsustainable. Greece cannot forever be run as a debt colony of its Eurozone creditors. The European Central Bank needs a political master, and it shouldn't abuse its vast, unaccountable power by acting in a brazenly political way on issues well outside its narrow remit for monetary policy. And nor is it acceptable to strip voters of the right to make legitimate economic and political decisions, not least about how much governments tax and spend. No taxation without representation was the rallying cry of the American Revolution. No austerity without accountability may be its European equivalent now. That's why, as I explain in my book, European Spring, we need a European spring of economic and political renewal, and you all can help drive it. Thank you.
Thank you, Philip. Our second speaker, and this has been the hardest thing for me to try, is Katarzyna Simielewicz. She is Katarzyna is a lawyer who came over from the dark side. She is interested and specialized in human rights and technology, and she's a co-founder and president of Panopticon Foundation. Katarzyna, you have the floor.
Thank you. Let me say that it's a real pleasure to be here, and please give me the voice. Hello? Well, maybe I change the table. Okay,
Yeah.
I got Philips.
The battery of this thing is flat.
That's not a gender discrimination, I suppose. Thank you. Let me say that it is a real pleasure to be here, and I mean it. My job usually is to go in front of institutions, talk to them, and their job is to listen. But it's hardly ever that experience that I have tonight to speak to real people who come because they are concerned with politics, and more, they want to be active and actively shape the agenda they choose. This is something I respect, and this is something that makes me feel part of the same movement. So thank you for making this possible. And I'm also standing here because I agree with both the manifesto and the diagnosis that this movement has already produced. So I'm not going to argue against that. I think the crisis of political representation and the crisis of political accountability are facts. We don't have to explain them better. We see them, we experience them more, we experience their consequences. The country where I live and work, Poland, it's already the country fully taken by a populist agenda exactly because of those crises that started at the EU level. So we already live the consequences of those problems. What is worth doing still, I think, is trying to move a step back to better understand how they came about so that building the new agenda, we will hopefully not repeat those mistakes. And here, let me bring just two short observations in this short time I have, referring to what I know best, to EU policy affecting human rights, affecting citizens directly, EU policy on surveillance, for example. And here the first sin, the first flaw that I deeply feel and makes me extremely frustrated. For years I've been involved in this politics, is the fact that it is EU institutions themselves that started flirting with populist agenda and exploiting fear-based policy. It wasn't Poland, and it wasn't any other government I know that came up with crazy idea of mandatory data retention, for example, of all citizens, or collecting PNR data of everybody who travels with the plane, just in case we might happen to be terrorists. Those policies were born in Brussels, even though from the very beginning it was clear to the decision makers themselves that they are not based on any evidence. They were created for the reason you know very well, because it is in your diagnosis. They were created to escape deeper problems, mostly economic problems, that cause real anger in people. Those were the problems that EU did not want to respond. So instead of solving the real ones, they created, in a way, fake issues, like the war on terror, which becomes less and less fake, more and more real, as we also experience more surveillance, more division, more mistrust in the society. I'm not arguing now that we created terrorism inside of EU, but we certainly not help solving it by creating more walls, more gaps in the society, and more surveillance. So this is the first major flaw that I think we have to learn from, not to repeat it. Second one is connected to the fact that not all the policies I know are negative ones. EU, in my experience as civic lobbyists, came up with some good ideas. Some of them were actually conceived as protective for citizens, especially in the world of data protection, internet services, consumer laws. We have many protections in the EU law designed to help people to balance this imbalanced relationship between corporates and individuals. But even if they are created, they are never communicated as such. We always, as civic lobbyists, as activists, we have to fight for communicating them. We have to fight against corporate lobbies trying to kill them. There's nobody coming and helping us from the institution side. Sometimes Parliament is on our side, but in the major battles, one of them was documented in quite interesting documentary called Democracy, for a reason, made by David Burnett on the process of creating new data protection framework. You will see a bunch of activists, poorly funded, self-organized, trying to confront the biggest industrial lobbies without any support from the EU itself. And now we have those laws implemented, and I find myself in a strange position with zero funding, including EU itself, to make any campaign that would explain to people what is actually changing and why it might be good for them. So what we will see consumers lost, frustrated, confused, maybe convinced by leading technological companies that those laws are actually against them. So we see this. We see populism, we see fear-based policy where sound, good policies are needed, but they don't exist. And we don't see strong communication directing people, individuals, where EU is trying to actually help them. And those are the two areas where I have direct experience and where I could suggest a more positive agenda. But before moving to positive, which is, I believe, second part of this event, I want to stop with concern or question something that puzzles me now. I know for this movement, the basic concept is to move from bureaucratic structures with no democracy into direct democracy, engaging people and people's movements. I love this idea myself. I'm ready to fight for it. But same as me, you are aware of the fact that so many of those movements, so many of those peoples in Europe now, in response to the crisis that you diagnose, actually became populists themselves, became angry, became revanchist. They demand something that Polish government, trying to explain itself, calls radical democracy, democracy of the majority, where majority takes everything and is not going to respect values that we would like to see respected, like human rights, dignity, rights of migrants, rights of others. So what do we do with those movements? What do we do with those actual real movements of real people who have those demands because of the crisis that was created? This is the big question that I'm now posing here, hoping for more discussion with you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you. So that leaves our third speaker, which I'm very happy to introduce to you, Alice Mary Higgins. She is an independent senator from the Republic of Ireland. She is head of a civil engagement group, and she has been an advocate and campaigner for equality and social justice for more than 15 years, both in Europe and in Ireland.
Hello, and it's wonderful to be here. I was initially asked to talk about Brexit, but that changed, and I felt that it was important that we also focus on the bigger picture. So as Ireland shares a land and sea border with the United Kingdom, it is, of course, particularly and negatively affected by Brexit. But what I wanted to do today was to highlight and maybe suggest some of the wider conversations that I think we all, as Europeans, need to have, conversations that were already important, but now, in the light of Brexit, have become even urgent. First conversation. Securitization is not the same as peace building, and Europe needs peace building. The Northern Ireland peace process and the Good Friday Agreement have rightly been acknowledged to have a central place in the first round of Brexit negotiations, with a particular focus on the border. Something that has got less attention is another part of that agreement which commits to human rights cooperation. Not just citizens' rights, but human rights. Because of course, peace building is never just about borders. It is always about rights, about social investment, about political empowerment, and about hope for the future. And that's not just true in Northern Ireland, it's true for centuries. And it's something that was deeply understood in Europe and in America after World War II, and in the founding moments of both the United Nations and the European Union. But Europe in recent years has neglected the work of peace building. And the policies of austerity, as we've heard, have blocked essential social investment and compromised democratic accountability, sowing divisions and leading to the kind to the kinds of tensions, just like that there, and violence that we've been hearing about, that we heard about from Johannes. Even at the same time as we in Europe have not been minding the peace, there's been an ever-growing narrative and emphasis on securitization, increasingly militarized borders, fences, Frontex, a revived push for a common European defense force, and a Europe that is willing to compromise on human rights for the sake of dubious and dangerous immigration control agreements with countries such as Turkey and Libya. Those compromises are not just brutal for the people involved, they also damage Europe's international diplomatic credibility at a time when, according to the head of NATO, we are in one of the most dangerous moments in global history, in the papers today. The answer to these global challenges is not another army. Europe needs to reprioritize peace building. It's something the public understand. The number one issue when people on the European street by Eurobarometer were asked, how do we face global challenges? They talked about social equality and solidarity. We need to prioritize peace building within and beyond our borders. And it's important maybe to note that neutral countries have a special role to play in this. Because, of course, it was Ireland's neutrality which allowed it to play a key role in driving the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, an issue which has again entered center stage. Second conversation. We can have a new and better trade model in Europe. When the second round, before the second round of Brexit negotiations begin, the European Commission will have to seek and receive a new trade negotiating mandate from the European Council. And it's vitally important that that new trade negotiating mandate is not taken off the same peg as CETA and TTIP. I have been proud to be part of the parliamentary and public resistance to CETA and to TTIP. All those who read and understood the implications of this deal and who have forced it onto the agenda nationally and across Europe. And there has, of course, now been two very significant European Court of Justice rulings against the European Commission in this regard. One, which reminded them that parliaments will have to ratify, and a second, which said they were wrong to ignore a citizens' initiative signed by over 3 million Europeans to ask them to reconsider this model of trade. And there is, of course, since we are in Belgium, just this week, a new and very important case which has been brought to the European Court of Justice, asking and challenging whether the investor court system is in fact legal under European law. In this context, it would surely be foolish and irresponsible if we were to have again the same model of new generation neoliberal trade deal as the blueprint that we give to the European Commission going into negotiations with the United Kingdom. We as the public have a real chance now, before the decision is made, to press for an alternative trade mandate. One which, just for example, would place European standard on equality, employment and environment, standards which have been vitally important for my country, at the center of the next trade mandate. Third conversation. Public confidence and engagement is more important for Europe's future than market sentiment. It seems as an obvious statement, but market sentiment is still guiding so much of the decision-making in Europe. The quarterly reports as opposed to the long-term vision. Even the long overdue social pillar, which was launched in spring, borrows, somewhat bizarrely, its language from the stock market. So societies who have been decimated by reckless financial speculation are now encouraged to work for a social AAA rating, such as the rating agencies may offer. Brexit is just one of many warning bells that tell us people in Europe now don't see themselves represented or participating in decision-making. We've gone from a democratic deficit to a democratic disconnect, where people, many people, genuinely cannot track how can they democratically influence the decisions which affect their lives. It's vital, and I think it's the most important work for Europe now, that we restore that faith, that we make the radical reforms, that restore that faith for people at national and at international level. Being in Europe should feel like a widening and a deepening of the decision-making debate. It should feel like a widening of democratic deliberation. It should feel like more opportunities for personal political action and influence on the huge global challenges which so many of us know faces and which we know we cannot deal with on a small and local level. It must not be allowed to feel like a narrowing. We, as Europeans, really have a chance to shape the future. And I think that's why these debates, there's so many other conversations, but of course, and the conversations that many of you have had at the debates today. But I think this is why the DiEM movement and movements like that are very important, and I'm looking forward to hearing what conversations all you feel we are maybe not having yet at European level. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a couple of minutes to deal with some of the questions that have appeared on the screen and some of the questions that came out of the session earlier today. I'm going to address the first question to Philip, which is going to be about economics. I'm not going to ask the question that was on there, which said, what are the growth recipes that DiEM25 proposes? Because we already have a good bit of an answer in that. And I'm going to come back to my first point, which is that you're all invited to co-write those solutions and to be part of the solution. Now, the question I would ask you is, if we know that there are elections coming up in Germany, and there is the European Parliament in 2019, there's one election that is not coming up, which is the replacement of Mario Draghi. The replacement of the president, Mario Draghi. Mario Draghi, yes. He's not, whoever is going to replace him will not be elected. Do you think that the taboo of the independence of the European Central Bank needs to be addressed?
I think Europe has got himself into a very dangerous position whereby it's created the most extremely independent central bank in the world. One that floats above national governments, whose extreme independence is enshrined in a treaty that could only be changed by unanimity, and where Germany and others ensure that that will never happen. And then you have this super central bank that floats above national governments, which then, instead of saying we're in a really special position here and we need to tread carefully and be respectful of accountability and democratic norms, goes out and acts in brazenly political ways, like, for example, its intervention in cutting off liquidity to Greek banks, which in effect ended the Athens Spring. But in other ways too, by refusing for a long time to intervene to quell the panic ripping through financial markets in the Eurozone, which led to the undemocratic unseating of someone I don't particularly like, but still was democratically elected, Silvio Berlusconi, or indeed of the then Prime Minister of Greece, which now has taken on huge new powers about how you oversee and restructure banks. Restructuring banks, whether you bring in public money, how you assign the losses, an essentially extremely political decision, and where, frankly, the ECB is, by its very nature, thinks and interacts primarily with the bankers that it's meant to be regulating and who ultimately it needs to impose losses on. That too is extremely troubling. So I think Europe, I have a problem. I think central bank independence made sense in a time when the job of a central bank seemed very simple. There was a common agreement that inflation was a bad thing. There was more or less common agreement that politicians weren't very good at keeping it down, and that with that in mind, central banks could do a better job and governments could get on with ensuring the other goals of economic policy. That consensus has now broken down, and we've got ourselves into a position here in Europe where we can't do anything about it. And I think there needs to be a big democratic backlash against the ECB. There needs to be a pressure for change. Ultimately, otherwise, the only way in which we can sort of get out of this is if we create a fully fiscal Eurozone, and I don't think that's going to happen overnight, a fully fiscal Eurozone with a democratically elected Eurozone authority, which then could hopefully impose some political and democratic control on the essentially political decisions that the ECB often takes.
Thank you. I have a question for Alex Mary. You mentioned trade deals, and some of the questions that came about is about how the structure of those things need to go back to a more democratic level. And some of the questions that were joined in said, democracy is really about giving a voice to people who don't have a voice. You're an elected politician. Yes. Can we hire you for a 2-minute free consultancy on how DiEM25 can be more inclusive and more reaching out to people who don't have a voice today?
Okay. The trade or the reaching out, or both? Well, okay. First, on the trade, if I understand, yes, we absolutely need to have the discussions because the decisions made in relation to trade shape the future and they shape the possibilities for each of our countries. And it is, for example, one of the most sinister elements of the trade deals that have been put forward, particularly CETA, that it's a negative list system. So that everything that is not normally in a trade deal, you would decide, what do we want to trade on? But in a negative list system, everything that is not explicitly taken off the table is automatically included in the trade deal. And if we think about what that means, it means, and Ireland, for example, has, I think, 3 or 4 pages only of exceptions. All these areas of operation, of all these areas of collective decision-making are now coming under the restrictions of this trade deal and the threat, for example, of corporate courts. And also, all future areas, sectors that we don't even know exist yet, ones we haven't developed, they come under the remit as well. So that's one of the reasons that we deeply need democratic debate about our trade deals, and we need to absolutely make sure that our future possibilities and options are not surrendered to the interests of perhaps a few corporate interests and sectors who prevail today. In terms of reaching out, this is a huge challenge. For me, in the Irish Parliament, I came from civil society, and that's why I formed, with others, the Civil Engagement Group, to send a message and a signal to say, we are here as your voice in from civil society, and we believe that Parliament needs your opinions on all of these issues. And we go and look, and we ask for opinions, and we identify who we feel is being affected by these issues, and even if they don't come to us, we go to try to find them. And I think that's very important. But I think it's also, but this is also a challenge for for the unions, for those like myself who worked for many years in the feminist movement, to find and see not just the huge issues we are fighting ourselves, but where they intersect and where they complement, and to also look constantly for new voices. So I think sometimes when we are fighting on a few different fronts and a few different arguments, it can feel hard to take on another issue like Europe. When I try to get community groups in Ireland excited to talk about Europe, because they're doing so much. So I think we need to make that connection between lived life and the decisions which shape it, so that you know you're not just unlucky, you know, but you're not just somebody who maybe hasn't come to the top in the battle for success, but that you are somebody whose voice is necessary for policies that work. So I think that message, to try to get that out to people, and happily give a list of other suggestions at another time.
Thank you. So, Katarzyna, I will ask you then a final question. One of the questions that came up was the relative weakness, it was posited, of DiEM25 in Central Europe. Now, Central Europe is catching up with the rest of Europe. But I would like you to, if you could, talk a little bit. You said earlier that you want to change the debate and change the way policy debate is happening in Europe. If you could say one or two values that you think are important in this respect to change the way we're debating about democracy and technology, with a specific focus on Central Europe. If you could talk about that for just 2 seconds.
Of the European public.
Yes.
Thank you for the question. I'm still muted. Okay, let's. I think it's a broader for. Okay. Maybe I take. Let's try now. No. I'm still on mute. It worked when we tried, so it's a sabotage, last-minute sabotage. Well, back to Central Europe, and a very good question regarding the values. Well, I'm not sure if we are different thinking of the region, which I believe I know and I feel for. We are different in terms of values. I still think it's mostly the issue of communicating what EU is about, the way that it can be understood and absorbed by people no matter where they live, where they come from. So certainly, let's take economic development, something we strongly feel about because that's the base on which we stand. If we here say that in Spain there is a problem because people cannot afford to pay back loans and they cannot afford pension schemes and they cannot afford holidays, and in Poland it has never been the case that people of my age could ever dream about pension scheme. My pension is likely to be €100, and I know that, and I could never afford to buy a flat in the city I live. We clearly start from a different starting points, right? So maybe it's less about values. I think we share values, we share the same idea, concept of good life, of fair society, of inclusion. But maybe the language in which we communicate, especially EU institutions, has to be more inclusive of very different living conditions that people have. And here comes obviously also the question of well, culture, soft things like our attitude to migrants, to LGBT, to people of different sexual orientation. You know, Poland is very symptomatic for having here, how to say, more conservative standpoint. Well, it's not exactly how it is inside of the country. There are so many people who, when confronted with the other, behave normally. I know people who confronted with the mayor of Słupsk, one of the Polish cities, who is open gay and the first very outspoken gay in Polish politics, actually adore him and admire him because they met a real human being who speaks to them in a human language, not about him being gay, but about issues they care about. So really, I think that the miracle that has to happen to bridge those gaps is to start communicating things people really care about in the language they actually understand, maybe without using too many abstract layers and too many well, concepts like gender or equality. Maybe those concepts are not something that people feel strongly about. But if you talk to them about their future, their pension schemes, their health, the future of their kids, if you show them a real human being suffering next to them, they are likely to react with empathy and understanding. And this is what I can even see in my country. There is an anecdote I can bring here. 2 years ago, we saw something incredible in Polish politics. There was a standard political debate before the elections, and the debate was joined by then unknown Adrian Zandberg, one of the leaders of the New Left, a guy that nobody heard of. That guy came with the most radical views you can imagine in my country. But he was speaking about solutions, he was speaking about problems in the language people could understand. Nobody else did it because everybody else was obviously full of hate, just having personal fights and having standard escapist general ideas in this debate. What happened? My parents, my cousins, people from the place where I come from Polish North, were coming to us asking, who is that guy? We never heard politicians speaking like this. They didn't vote on him because they would think it's a lost vote and he was too radical. But it was a breakthrough. Somebody came and started addressing people's issues openly, without faking it, without avoiding it. I think this is the kind of dialogue we need. And then if we do that in the politics, values come next. If we discuss values as a starting point, if we give them difficult names, if we talk about gender equality and sustainability the way people don't understand, we might have clear opposition, east-west, and other bridges to break. Thank you.
Thank you. So that was our approach to some of the problems of the real State of the Union. We didn't cover all the rest. That would have taken us too long. Some of the other questions that came out were about how DiEM25 is going to try to address providing answers to the problems of the real State of the Union, and that will be the rest of the program, where Yanis will lead us through. I would like you to please thank and applaud our three speakers who have done an excellent job. And I will repeat my invitation to all of you to come to all the next DiEM25 meetings, and that when I have to ask people who has contributed to our work, that you can all say, I have participated to that voice. Thank you.
Well, we talked about the real state of the union. By the way, it's wonderful to be here tonight. Either DiEM is doing something really right, or nightlife on Saturday night in Brussels sucks. One of the two, or both. But thank you for being here. And let me just, before we continue, thank our wonderful volunteers. It sounds like a stereotype, but it's so true. Particularly Eric Edmond, who is going to finish off tonight. I just felt the need to thank them as we're moving ahead. So we talked about the real state of the union. So the question now is, what do we do about it? Because after all, there is nothing less impressive than criticism of the status quo, lacking alternative proposals about what we can do tomorrow morning, not in some distant future, not when we are all tall, blonde, Swedish and socialist, but tomorrow morning. Because this lack of a pragmatic, realistic agenda that can be implemented tomorrow morning is what is the cause of the most toxic dogma in the history of Europe. We call it Euro-Tina. The dogma, the dictum that there can be no alternative in this European Union. DiEM was put together to smash Euro-Tina, to replace Tina with Tatiana. That, astonishingly, there is an alternative. So, this session that I'm chairing, for better or for worse, is about what we call the European internationalist New Deal. I'm going to talk to you about what we've been doing as DiEM25 over the last 18 months, because we really tried very hard to smash Euro-Tina by means of an economic and social agenda, a policy framework, as my friend Professor Jeff Sachs would say, that answers the question, okay, this is what they're doing, the establishment, what should they be doing? Because unless we have that, we cannot harness anger and turn it into hope. For 18 months now, we have worked hundreds, if not thousands, of DiEMers to put it together. I invite you to visit our site, DiEM25.org, and go into European New Deal and actually read the document. Read the summary, and then if that whets your appetite, read the document. But I want to say a few words before introducing to you the other two speakers of this session that I'm going to keep as a surprise for the time being. I'm just chuffed at the thought that I shall be introducing them to you. But first, New Deal. Now, the original New Deal, the American New Deal of FDR, of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, aimed at financial stabilization, reconstruction, conservation, and employment. Jobs for the jobless, public works, power systems and new industries, especially in the south of the United States, soil conservation and reforestation to deal with the ecological disaster known as the Dust Bowl, and a potent mix of regulations and insurance to assert public power over high finance. Today in Europe, we need all that stuff. Our overgrown banks, well, not our, theirs, haunted by the specter of insolvency, are evicting families today on an accelerating basis. States are bankrupt and will only get more so as the European Central Bank begins to taper its quantitative easing program under pressure from German capital crushed by the negative or very low interest rates. Like America 80 years ago, Europe has a vast periphery. In our south, there is a semi-permanent Great Depression, whereas in the east, there is a great need for a new industrial sector, renewed industries, transport networks, housing, and social investments. Above all else, Europeans across the continent need jobs. Now, unlike in the United States in the 1930s, Europe is also facing the menace of disintegration as the absence of a democratic federal system has spawned a legitimacy crisis. Philippe Legren mentioned this before. Paralysis in the face of deindustrialization and chronic unemployment is poisoning our politics, begetting a xenophobic neo-fascism. Europe has not suffered to this day ecological calamities comparable to what happened in the last few weeks in Texas and in Florida, but they're coming, make no mistake, in the form of droughts, of rising sea levels, and unstoppable waves of refugees from climate change-inflicted countries. Our European New Deal was indeed inspired by FDR, but it was designed for European conditions. Chief among these is the sad fact that the European Union is a weak and timid thing, a confederacy, more or less. The crisis has made it virtually impossible even to discuss the creation of a proper federation in Europe. European politics and European polities, voters, are so alienated by the authoritarian incompetence of our current authorities that an increase in central powers, in the powers of Brussels, what Emmanuel Macron is referring to as more Europe, sounds like a nightmare to majorities across Europe. So, DiEM's position is that it is necessary to work within existing European charters and treaties, to redeploy existing institutions in order to bring about the stabilization which is necessary in order to create the political space where we can actually discuss a proper federation. This is why we need a New Deal. Only if we stabilize by means of a New Deal that utilizes and redeploys existing institutions, the European Union, only then can we start the discussion about the constitutional process that will yield a proper democratic constitution for Europe that brings democracy and federation in one package to Europeans. Now, to this end, and by the way, END also stands for European New Deal, we have proposed 3 programs for all European countries, and make a note of this, Our European New Deal is not just about the Eurozone. It's not even just about the European Union member states that are not in the Eurozone. It's about all European countries, even those who are on the verge of leaving the European Union, United Kingdom, Switzerland, Serbia, countries that never entered. So the three programs that we envisage are, firstly, a green transition program led by a new agency whose aim is to provide a continent-wide infrastructure focusing on the green energy union and the technological sovereignty that Europe so desperately needs. That's number one. Number two, an economic and social stabilization program, including an anti-poverty drive that involves US-style food stamps, a social housing program, and importantly, a jobs guarantee program to offer employment to all Europeans seeking jobs within their communities at a national living wage, with emphasis in care, giving individuals, outfits, NGOs, and organizations, ending thus the involuntary migration within Europe. Thirdly, a universal basic dividend that allows Europeans, not income, but dividend, that allows Europeans to share in the returns of capital and automation, not to be funded by taxes, but to be funded by, I will explain this in a minute so as not to confuse you, but it will be a first step towards the democratization of the economic realm, of the economic sphere, and the prevention of the next crisis from falling aggregate demand due to the displacement of workers by artificial intelligence. Now, specifically for the Eurozone, because our European New Deal focuses on different parts of Europe as well, for the Eurozone, we propose 3 therapeutic policy interventions whose great advantage is that they need no European Union treaty change and can be implemented tomorrow morning. Firstly, a step-by-step banking union that simulates, if you want, the creation by the Roosevelt administration of something like the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. And secondly, restructures all of Europe's problem banks, placing them, every time each one of them is restructured, under effective control of the European Central Bank and the European Stability Mechanism on behalf of European citizens. That's the first therapeutic policy just for the Eurozone. The second one is a program by which the European Central Bank mediates between member states and money markets by means of a public financial engineering mechanism so as to reduce their total debt burden, but without money printing by the Central Bank and without the surplus countries like Germany guaranteeing or paying for the debts of laggards like Greece, Portugal, even Italy. And thirdly, something that we really need in the Eurozone, something like a Chapter 11 public debt restructuring facility for unpayable legacy public debts, and not just for Greece. Now, of course, the obvious question is, how do you fund these programs? In the absence of a federal treasury and in the absence of a European Central Bank that has a suitable remit. The Green Transitions Works Authority that I mentioned before will be funded by a combination of 2 things. Firstly, an alliance between the European Investment Bank that issues its own, it's been doing it for many, many years, bonds, in association, in collaboration with the European Central Bank that sits idly by, waiting in the secondary markets, but with an explicit remit to purchase these bonds in order to keep the yields level low and allow the European Investment Bank to be the outfit that manages a New Deal investment-led, green investment-led recovery program for the whole of Europe. And secondly, from a continental-wide carbon tax. For the economic and social stabilization program, the funding, we propose the creation of what we call a European equity depository, into which 2 kinds of incomes stream into. Profits from the financial assets purchased by our central banks in the context of their quantitative easing programs, and all other sorts of seigniorage profits that central banks make, plus a pan-European harmonized inheritance tax. Finally, the universal dividend that I promised you before I was going to say something about its funding should be funded not by taxation, but by The dividends from a percentage of shares from every corporate IPO or capital raising exercise, and levies on intellectual property rights and on common knowledge monopolies. This will be a small payment, but it will grow as automation grows and as human labor is being displaced by the rise of the machines. Then, of course, there is the broader issue of the euro. The reality is that Europe created a common central bank without a common state to have its banks, to have its back, to support it. And we left 19 states without a central bank to have their back. This euro will either perish or it will evolve. A look at the real state of our monetary union reveals the following. There are countries like Denmark and the United Kingdom that will never join the euro. There are others, Sweden, Poland, Hungary, that are supposed to join in the future. They have a contractual agreement to join, but they will never join. And then there are Cyprus and Greece, which under capital controls, effectively, we have a de facto dual currency system, because a substantial sum of euros in a Greek or Cypriot bank are not worth the same as they are in a German bank. So we have 2 euros already. Lastly, many countries in the euro will be better off outside, including rich, in-surplus countries like Finland, or countries that are too big to bully, like Italy. So what should we do? Our modest proposal, as part of our European New Deal, is that we create in every country a public digital payments platform. Using the existing digital platform of our state taxation tax offices, our IRSs, taxpayers will be given the opportunity of purchasing digital tax credits, which they can then use to pay each other or to extinguish future taxes at a substantial discount. These credits would be denominated in euros, but transferable only between taxpayers of the particular country, thus impervious to destructive capital flight. Meanwhile, governments would be able to create a limited number of these credits, these euro-denominated credits, to be given to citizens in need as part of the anti-poverty drive or for funding public projects. These fiscal euros, as I call them, would allow stressed governments to stimulate demand, lessen the tax burden, and ultimately reduce the crushing power of the European Central Bank upon our parliaments. In the long term, these public digital payment systems and platforms can form a managed system of country-specific euros that work like an international clearing union. That was the original idea of John Maynard Keynes behind the Bretton Woods system, an idea that, tragically, was not adopted by the Americans in 1944. Now, let me set aside all these technicalities with which I destroyed your Saturday night. What's the gist of our European New Deal? It provides the best chance to make Europe worth saving while saving it. Now, some of you may ask, is Europe and the European Union in particular worth saving? Many of our fellow Europeans think it's not. There are 4 excellent reasons why it is worth saving. Firstly, Europe still defends human rights as well as health, safety, and environmental standards that will go to the dogs if the European Union disintegrates. Secondly, integrated production networks are efficient, and disrupting them, as the Soviet or the Yugoslav experience have taught us, is very costly. Thirdly, returning to national currencies is not a panacea. It's not going to generate utopia. I tell my fellow leftists in Greece, you know, folks, I'm quite old. I remember life under the drachma. It was not exactly a socialist paradise. Our countries would still be subject to the power of international investors and subject to our local oligarchies that would get stronger, I think, if Europe disintegrates and xenophobia rises up. And lastly, population movements cannot be stopped and should not be stopped. And population movement will become more toxic politically if we build new border fences and electrify them. So in the long run, Europe must become a democratic federation with a common approach to the environmental crisis, to the capitalist crisis, and to the challenges presenting, or challenges that will be presenting to us, of post-capitalist forms of production and distribution made inescapable by technological innovation. But this will only be possible after European peoples come to appreciate Europe as a constructive force in their lives, a visible, palpable, useful presence. That's the purpose of our European New Deal. It is our antidote to the Eurotina, as I said before. This is why we're determined, and this is a sort of announcement, as DiEM25, to make sure that our European New Deal not only evolves over the next year or two, but it also is presented to European voters at a ballot box near them everywhere by 2019. Thank you. And now for the second speaker of this session. His name is Jeff Sachs. He's a professor from Columbia University. He's one of those few public intellectuals, economists, who have been engaged with Mephistopheles for many years in a tussle to the death and did not come out compromised. I have to say that this is a very important moment for me personally, because when I was in the Greek Ministry of Finance, Jeff Sachs held my hand for 5 months, and he shares all the blame for the fact that we were crushed. We had a very good plan, a fantastic plan. You can read it, it's on the internet, on ending the Greek crisis. You know what happened to it? I won't give you the complete lowdown, but I'll just remind you of one of my favorite quotations. It's by a boxer, Mike Tyson, who once said, "They all have a plan until I punch them in the nose." Now, Jeff is also head of the Earth Institute, is that correct, Jeff? At Columbia University. And he's traveling the world in order to educate governments and effectively populations across the planet about the importance of sustainable development. And he was going to talk to us about what we need to do in Europe and what DiEM needs to push forward in terms of sustainable development globally and in Europe. Jeff Sachs.
Oh my God, this is really good. And I'll tell you why it's really good. When you're an American these days, you go around the world, I'm sorry, I didn't vote for him. Yes, he's a madman. You spend most of your time, but tonight it's Franklin Roosevelt, yes. And Roosevelt really was our greatest president, and unbelievable, and helped America in a really bad crisis, preserve the democratic spirit, preserve the sense of equality. Of course, we had to also join in the horrific war against fascism. And he also helped to build the institutions to take us out from that war to the United Nations and many really incredible things. And by the way, just as a coincidence, I was reading a document this afternoon that where Roosevelt requested in 1944, 1 year left of the war, he wrote to his science advisor, Vannevar Bush, what should we do with all this great science that is being built for the war effort to make it useful for fighting disease, building peace, building jobs? So the man was absolutely always thinking forward. And it's actually stunning to read this thing. because it is so wise to ask the questions, and the answers that he got from this Vannevar Bush in something called Science, the Endless Frontier, is actually pretty relevant for Europe also, because what Vannevar Bush said back to Roosevelt after a year of study is, invest in science and technology, it'll help build a much brighter future. And I think that it was, at that time, there was no such thing as peacetime science policy. Now we have it, but it was really an incredible insight. Well, let me say I love what you're doing, Yanis, and I thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here and being part of this thing. It's really great, and actually, I need to take a picture. Excuse me. Could you wave just for a moment? Thank you. Good. Okay, I want to show Bernie when I get home. I'll see him next week. Exactly. I had the great delight of being Bernie Sanders' foreign policy advisor on his campaign, and he came very close, you know, and he would have trounced this idiot that we have as president right now had he made it to the general election. But the status quo was pretty tough, and Bernie just, despite the insurgency, despite having the right message, despite telling the truth and being an absolutely wonderful person and incredibly fun too, he just didn't quite make it because of the power of the status quo. And that's really what we're up against in part. And I think the way you put it earlier is exactly right, that the reason why we have to fight is not only that the status quo is inadequate, but the forces on the right, the hate, the discontent that spills over into violence. You see it, of course, in the United States, and we've got, again, this sociopath as president who feeds this. So it's really a time when we have to make a breakthrough that says no to the violence, no to the right-wing jingoism or racism, and also no to the idea that this is the only way, that we can't do better than this. And that's exactly what Bernie was and is saying to the American people, and it's exactly what you're saying, and I think it could not be more urgent and true. Now, on the question, is the European Union worth saving? Oh my God, don't even ask. You better save it. The world desperately needs it. Honestly, you've got to make it work. It is the most important political invention to be made right in the whole world. And I don't say that casually. I travel all over the world. Wherever I am, I say, I love you. But I really love the European Union. Honestly. Not only, obviously, was it the project to stop war within Europe, but the European Union is the place on the planet that is closest to the vision of sustainable development. It's the place that best, not perfectly, in fact, with a lot of crises, but comes closest to combining prosperity, fairness, and green. And in the United States, we don't even come 50th on the fairness and the green part right now. We need the voice of Europe. And Europe does all of that with an incredible and firm commitment to democracy and to human rights. And so it's the place we desperately look to show that this can work. And by the way, it's not so far from working. It's not as if this is the most hopeless, horrendous place in the world. You know, I serve as advisor to the Secretary General of the UN on the Sustainable Development Goals. So every year we make a ranking and go online. It's called SDG Index. We just published it a few weeks ago. Who are all the countries at the top of the list for being closest to having that combination of prosperity and long life and health, together with the lowest inequality in the world, actually, objectively measured by the Gini coefficient or other data, and the greenest intentions and plans, not yet realized, but the determination to get there, and that is Europe. So you fill the top of the list. And my plea to you is hold it together, overcome the kind of paralysis right now. On this, Trump should be a good spur to you, right? This, unfortunately, is not the old North Atlantic alliance that we once knew. You got a weirdo on the other side. We're going to get it back, okay? But you come first to show the way. And show that Europe can use the concept of smart, fair, sustainable investment as a vision, as a commitment, as a set of unifying principles, and as a program. Because it's actually within your reach to get there sooner than any other part of the world, and to make this place the beacon, which it basically is, by the way, but really can be. And without all the angst that I feel every time I come to Europe. You want angst? Come to my place. I'll show you real angst. You just have to get moving. And that's the beauty of what this initiative is. What do you need to do? I think I won't go into all the technical details. I don't get them yet. But the green, without question. You need green-led growth. Not so complicated. And what did Yanis and I say to Minister Schäuble, and I've tried for years? Connect the grid, to Greece. They got lots of sunshine and lots of wind power in the Aegean. And you can have a green energy system. You can have a Greek recovery by doing something. It's not so hard. So the first thing is think green, sustainable, decarbonize the energy system. That's vital. Honest to God, by the way. By the way, I am in a running email battle with, you can't even, it's almost impossible to understand. I'll just call them people from Texas, who are on my case every day. Oh, you say that Hurricane Harvey's because of climate change. You're an idiot. Oh, you say that Hurricane Irma's from climate change. You're an idiot. You say that it's all coincidence, The 3 hottest years in the world, the most powerful storms ever observed, droughts, floods, famine. It's all a coincidence, ladies and gentlemen. Thank God. Don't worry about it. That's what goes on when you live under the phantasm of these lobbies. In this case, the U.S. is a petrostate. It's an oil and gas state which owns the Republican Party. That's why it all looks so weird. I'll just tell you a piece of good news. Our politicians are not as stupid as they look. Subject maybe with the president. I'm talking about the Congress. But they are a lot more corrupt than you realize. So they're just on the take of the oil industry. Fortunately, you don't have such a big oil industry, so you can go green without Chevron and ExxonMobil and the Koch brothers looking over your shoulder and totally buying out your politicians. Second, you need an investment strategy. And here, let me say, one of the points that was mentioned in the question was, what about China? China was called an emerging economy. China's not an emerging economy. China's an emerged economy. China's already the world's largest economy when measured at what we call international prices or purchasing power adjusted prices. China's done something really good, by the way. Their One Belt, One Road policy says, let's unite Eurasia with grid, with transport, with connectivity, with fiber. That's really a good idea, by the way, and they're ready to put in hundreds of billions of dollars into that. They're already doing it. They're setting up new institutions. Where is Europe on the other side of Eurasia to say, great, let's make the connection? That's actually a good idea. Wake up! There's some great opportunities. Third, follow FDR and Vannevar Bush. Invest in technology. Of course, I don't have to really say this here except to say that this is the real key for the long-term prosperity. Smart and a lot of investment in R&D and turning our new technologies into green and smart systems that can work for everybody. And Europe, take a look at the most recent rankings of universities. Of course, you fill the list. You have brilliant minds. You have the world's longest lived universities, some of the finest centers of knowledge in the entire world. They are a ticket for helping us solve all these problems. So using knowledge, using innovation, making sure that in the Eastern European countries where patenting is very low, in Southern Europe where innovation is very low right now, that you build a European-wide innovation system, that's going to be prosperity across Europe. And then two more points, ladies and gentlemen. Where did the refugees come from? I don't mean did they come from Syria or Afghanistan, that we know. But why did they come? Okay, they came because of war. Where did the war come from? From my country, from the CIA, which first started to overthrow the Afghan government back in 1979. The U.S. has been involved in Afghanistan in war, both covert and overt, for nearly 40 years. Iraq, absolutely against international law, of course, perhaps often called the most dreadful foreign policy decision in modern times, an absolutely unprovoked war, killed hundreds of thousands, displaced millions, created disaster, blowback, and refugees. And what about Syria? Was that really the result of the protests on the ground? No. That was the result of a decision of the United States and Saudi Arabia and France and others to try to overthrow Bashar al-Assad. I'm not here to make a brief for Bashar al-Assad, but I am here to say that covert regime change is against the law and is an unmitigated disaster. But the problem is, where was Europe's foreign policy? I kept looking. Is there a foreign policy? I even took out my microscope. I couldn't even find a microscopic foreign policy. Because where was Europe to say, no, US? You know, the president signed an order, a secret order, which once in a while shows up in our newspapers, for the CIA in Saudi Arabia to coordinate for the overthrow of Assad. Where was Europe to stand up and say no? Well, some countries in Europe were cheering. That's a disaster. Most were not cheering, but most were completely silent because there's no foreign policy to speak of. So the idea that the only policy is to debate should we accept refugees or not is not right. The real policy is stop the wars that are producing them. And let me make one final plea. I really love Europe, and I really love what is being built here. And in an imperfect world, it's pretty damn good. And one of the things that is special about Europe, but like everything else, it's under a lot of assault right now, is that after World War II, after the greatest disaster in the history of mankind, perhaps, Europeans realized that the way to peace was first to search for it, to yearn for it, and to be nice. I really commend the be nice part. It's really good for us. And so one part on the Greek crisis, and I watched things I could not quite believe as Yanis was trying to overcome this, and I have tried with George Papandreou and tried for years. Germany's not been nice enough. Because after you go through a Great Depression and your youth unemployment rate is 48% and output's gone down by 25%, you're just not being nice enough. And if people say, oh, you can't forgive the debt, there's moral hazard, believe me, anyone that says you want your debt forgiven, you just spend your time like Greece for a few years. No one will accept the bargain. So being nice is really crucial inside Europe, but it's also really important for one other thing, for your well-being and for the world's well-being. Europe for decades now has been the largest provider of development assistance. And this too, like many other great European actions, is under threat. And I hear it all the time. This is a battle I'm in every single day. And I hear people say, oh, aid, that doesn't work, or that's stolen, or that's corruption, or that's demeaning. Well, I've just spent 17 years advising the UN on fighting AIDS, getting malaria under control. The money is saving lives. It's desperately needed by poor people. And what's really needed now, ladies and gentlemen, if you want a solution to the migration challenge for the long term, help every African child get a decent education. It's simple. It is a rounding error of cost for us, and it is life and death, make or break for your neighbors. I count on you to succeed. I love this movement. It's amazing that you're all here, and thank you very much.
For years now, every time people like Jeff and myself were putting forward proposals as to what needs to happen at the pan-European level, in the Eurozone, and speaking personally in my own country, Greece, I would get a point-blank refusal by the powers that be even to consider it. I call it the Swedish national anthem routine, because I would speak to them, put forward particular proposals that I thought were quite well designed and developed, and I looked at their stares, blank stares. It was as if I had sung the Swedish national anthem. And the only thing they would say when they would get out of that, blank stare look is, well, it can't be done. A small country cannot do these things. Well, for years now, many years, even well before I became finance minister, I would answer their refusal, their denial to even discuss this with one word: Ecuador. Ecuador has done all the things that I tried to do when I was in the finance ministry. The parallel payment system, the creation of fiscal space, even though Ecuador does not have its own currency, challenging the central bank's supposed independence, creating a social system that actually looks after the many and not the few, introducing a number of constraints upon the powerful for the purposes of democratizing the economic, political, and economic sphere. You can understand why I'm chuffed. I'm very moved that tonight, here on this stage, I have the privilege of inviting the President of Ecuador, Rafael Correa, well, until very recently.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. I am really delighted. It's a pleasure for me to be here tonight. Thank you very much for your introduction. Kindly introduction. Well, it's a challenge to speak in English after Jeffrey Sachs. So, Janice, the next DiEM's event must be in Spanish. So I will be delighted to come back and to speak after Jeffrey. Well, dear friends, Ecuador has had a decade of great social, economic, and political success. It doubled the size of its economy, considerably reduced poverty and inequality, substantially increasing social services like schooling, health, and housing, and enhanced systemic competitiveness through vastly improving infrastructure, telecommunications, and energy. Our political project, the Citizen Revolution, has won 14 elections. Before our government, there were 7 presidents in 10 years. During the last decade, there was just 1 president re-elected 3 times. According to international studies, Ecuador was the country that best took advantage of the commodities boom. The last 2 years, we faced extreme difficulties. The drop in exports over a 2-year period amounted to 10% of GDP. At the same time, the American dollar, used as our national currency, strongly appreciated. Technically, in this kind of situation, you have to do exactly the opposite. You must depreciate your currency. We called this combination of export crash and currency appreciation the perfect storm. We also had several natural disasters, particularly an earthquake of almost 8 on the Richter scale, with about 4,000 replicas. During 2015 and 2016, we had to take several economic measures, yet poverty continued to decrease and inequality did not increase, something unthinkable in this kind of situation in Latin America. After 1 year of negative growth, the economy is now growing again. That means that we overcame the recession with minimal costs and in record time. A heterodox economic policy has shown better performance in both kinds of economic situation, either expansion or recession. Of course, with a national currency, everything will have been much easier. For instance, Colombia, our neighbor, Colombia, depreciated its currency more than 80%, and we did not have any instrument to respond to this. Currency is the most important short-term instrument of economic policy as well as social coordination. The title of this talk is Ecuador as a Case Study, Common Currency, Digital Payment Systems, and constitutional change. But this title is wrong. Ecuador does not have a common currency. Like the members of the European Union, Ecuador has a foreign currency. The European Central Bank at least knows where Greece is. If you ask the American Federal Reserve where Ecuador is, perhaps they will say in Africa. But okay, let's talk about common currencies, while bearing in mind that the case of Ecuador is even worse. Countries may have a common currency when they are in an optimum currency area. This means they have the same economic cycles, and therefore, they need the same monetary policy. If this is not the case, then for a common currency to work, they must have perfect labor mobility. The best monetary union in economic history is the United States. 50 states using the same currency. If, for instance, Texas and Arizona do not have the same economic cycle, the Texas unemployed can go to work in Arizona and vice versa. To have the same economic cycle means basically that two countries have similar economic structures. It will be interesting to see if Greece and Germany have similar economic structures or perfect labor mobility. However, in the Ecuadorian case, not only we do not have the same economic cycles with the United States, we actually have exactly opposite economic cycles, because Ecuador is an exporter of commodities and the United States imports them. And of course, labor mobility is inexistent unless you want to cross the Rio Bravo with some coyote. We eliminated the national currency after a terrible national crisis, financial crisis, in 1999. It was a political decision with no technical basis. We can call this a Nike policy. Just do it. As Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel Prize in Economics in 2001, rightly points out, dollarization controls inflation and nothing else. However, it is almost impossible to come out of dollarization. The exit costs are too high. For this reason, we propose 3 measures in order to mitigate the enormous restrictions imposed by dollarization. First, with our new constitution, the central bank depends on the central government. The central bank depends on the central government. Before, the central bank was an independent central bank. In this way, we can recover some monetary policy using the bank's reserves, and in the Ecuadorian case, we can partially control credit and financial policies. I should say that with or without dollarization, an independent central bank does not make any sense. If the central bank must be independent because monetary policy is a technical issue, as is usually argued, let's make ministries also independent, because health policy, educational policy, agricultural policy, etc., are also technical. Second, we literally need to send aircrafts in order to bring physical bills from the United States. And similarly, this bill can physically leave our country, causing a lack of liquidity in the process. This is why it is necessary to minimize the use of physical bills without harming the level of economic activity. One way is to use digital payment systems. For international trade, we already use a compensation system with some countries. This means that if Bolivia exports to Ecuador $100 million, and Ecuador exports to Bolivia 60 million, instead of using $160 million for our trade, we just pay the net difference to Bolivia. In our example, $40 million. For national trade, we have implemented the electronic wallet. You charge money on your mobile phone. I lost my mobile phone because before coming here. For this reason, I was late. Sorry about that. Bad memory. You charge money on your mobile phone, and you can make payments, transfers, etc. This is not to create new money, as is often misunderstood. It is just to increase the speed of monetary transactions. Again, digital payment systems are highly desirable with or without dollarization. But in the Ecuadorian case, it is something crucial. Finally, the most important and specific measure to counteract the detrimental effects of unilateral dollarization, as in the Ecuadorian case, are the instruments that correct imbalances in the external sector. The external sector, and not the fiscal sector, as is usually promoted for ideological purposes, is the Achilles heel of any developing country. And because of our unilateral dollarization, we lost the most important instrument that enables us to balance it, the exchange rate. To solve this tremendously severe problem, we can use a mechanism akin to carbon bonds. The state partially pays exporters with bonds, and the only way for importers to pay tariff is with those same bonds that importers have to buy in the marketplace. Because the amount of bonds is fixed, you can control the amount of imports. And the higher the price of the bonds, the greater the benefits for exporters, while imports become more expensive, thereby obtaining the same result as through currency depreciation. Dear friends, Ecuador's dollarization was a historic mistake and a technical absurdity. A possible long-run alternative for dollarization is to have a monetary union for South America, or at least for the Andean countries. We fulfill more closely the conditions required for the optimum currency area theory. In fact, the European Union, despite all its problems, and there are many, which is why it is so good for you to be gathered here discussing and thinking about the actual state of the Union, must nevertheless be an inspiration for our monetary and political union. You are 28 countries with 24 languages, different cultures, history, religions, political systems. While European countries have to explain to their citizens why they got together, Latin American countries must explain to their people why we have taken so long to integrate and indeed have yet to unite. Thank you very much.
There is no doubt that what you achieved during your term in office, or terms in office, has resonated on this side of the Atlantic, amongst progressives, amongst economists who have not studied properly what you've done, because what you've done is quite remarkable. The very description of how you try to deal with a major shock, external shock, without your own currency. It's what I was saying before, that, you know, every time representing Greece, I was told a small country has to accept TINA, that there is no alternative. Well, Ecuador was always an inspiration for this. By the way, there were times, Rafael, when I wish the European Central Bank didn't know where Greece was. but that's a big discussion. I've got a question that appeared actually on the screen, because we have a system here. We call it DiEM Voice. We're very proud of it. We collect questions, and these questions do not disappear at the end of our events. They become part and parcel of our data bank of important questions that come from our members, that come from these events, and they become the input into a dialogue that continues in between such events. And also, as Jonas Stahl said, they are also given out to artists who will at some point produce artworks like these ones here in response to this question. But there was one question that I want to put to you, Rafael. What would your advice be as a political economist and a former president of Ecuador to progressives in Europe about what our priorities should be today, both politically and in terms of policy?
You know, for me, the big problem is the capital empire. I call the capital empire that every law, every decision is in favor of capital, not in favor of human beings. So it's a political problem. You have to change the power relationship, no? The power balance, because everything is in function of capital and financial capital. For instance, the dependent central bank is an inflation-oriented central bank, because the only goal, the only vision is to control inflation. But there are other economic goals also. So it's a political problem, and you have to try. For the reason it's so good, it's very convenient, this kind of movement like DiEM25, in order to democratize Europe. You have to try that. Again, the citizens will have power, not the capital. So it's the basic problem. Okay?
Well, thank you so much. Now that you live in Belgium, I believe, we're going to turn you into one of the members of the DiEM25 local committees, whether you like it or not. This has been decided by acclamation. Thank you so much. And now we move on to the last section. The discussion shifted from what is the real state of the Union to what needs to be done. Now we're moving to a new phase. Who is going to do it, and what should our role be in it?
So, good evening. My name is Chris Keulemans. I'll moderate you through the last part of this evening. Evening full of inspiration, full of ideas for change, and that is exactly what we're going to talk about now in the last 45 minutes. How do we organize for change? How should Europeanists, inspired by speakers like tonight, proceed on the lead up to the European elections in 2019? We have two people ready to talk about this briefly. Afterwards, we'll have space for more of your questions. And finally, we'll have a call for action from four of the people you've seen on stage tonight. First up, the UK was the first country to withdraw its right to vote during the next European elections. From the UK is Rosemary Bechler. She's a member of the 12-member coordinating collective, and she's the editor of Open Democracy. There you go. Rosemary Bechler. And joining her on stage, Lorenzo Marsili, also member of the CC, writer, political activist, and the co-founder of European Alternatives. Rosemary Bechler will speak to us about the politics unleashed by Brexit and the importance of Europeans sticking together. The floor is yours.
On the eve of the EU referendum, I happened to find myself in a showing in London of David Bernet's quintessentially European film, Democracy, about the heroic struggle within the European Parliament to secure key digital laws protecting citizens and consumers from big data mining. Katarzyna, from whom we heard earlier, stars in this epic tale, alongside the heroic German Greens Jan Philipp Albrecht and Ralph Benrath, and Joe McNamee, Director of European Digital Rights. This is a David and Goliath story, a rare, gripping account in all its multi-layered complexity of a triumphant democratic lawmaking process. Remember that Dr. Schäuble quote that, from the Eurogroup meeting that Yanis mentioned earlier, that elections cannot be allowed to change an economic program of a nation state. Well, for those who haven't seen this film, Democracy, Albrecht's mission as rapporteur is the direct opposite. He argues 99% of the lobbying in Brussels is by companies, but millions of citizens have their interests too. No one has the right to claim their interests are worth more than that of the citizens. Let's be clear. The picture it paints is of a democratic process in jeopardy from giant vested interests. Yet exactly because it was such an unflinching record of the odds we are up against and the space for a political alternative that really exists, I wanted everyone I knew, and don't know, to see it. Here was everything that was missing from our Brexit debate, and everything that we Europeans must be doing over the next 2 years, leading into the 2019 elections and beyond. Why the urgency? Because all over Europe, there are people, like the British majority who voted for Brexit, who need to know what is possible in politics, and that they can do something about it. People who associate the threat to their jobs, security, and daily lives with the European institutions because for far too long we have been told over and over again what is not possible, due to the out-of-control forces that we are encouraged to believe are all the more irresistible at the transnational level. Take back control was the message of the 2016 Brexit referendum, seized on the first opportunity to express how fed up people were at the lack of accountable agency, the lack of empathy, the technocratic disavowal of responsibility before the socio-economic forces of austerity. As if on cue, only days after Theresa May lost her majority this June, Grenfell Tower in the country's richest borough of Kensington and Chelsea went up in flames, its blackening hulk an instant monument to the gulf between the authorities' shameless neoliberal negligence and a disenfranchised global working class who could get no one to listen to or do anything for them. This rejection of impotence that was Brexit might have remained at the level of a finger towards a world where all is said to be inevitable, had it not been for the snap elections in June. Here, not only did our Labour Party come up with one of the most progressive social democrat manifestos in living memory, but their new cohorts of activists launched a process of large-scale engagement with local publics, complemented by a wave of party and non-party grassroots progressives. Ordinary people stopping other ordinary voters in the street to talk about politics. This is not something seen before in much of the UK. But now we too had a glimpse of the energies unleashed in the Scottish independence referendum, or those energies emerging out of the 2011 social movements into frontline innovative politics in Ada Colau's international network of fearless cities. Watching the Grenfell Tower survivors organize their fight back for political and existential recognition was also another lesson for us in dignity and in democracy. Labour and their progressive allies using this initiative to salvage a recognizable bottom-up politics have given Britain a chance to pose a supremely political question. What is the room for maneuver for advancing social justice, for turning the tide against the worst effects of the financial crash and its extractive neoliberal aftermath? There's one factor in that question about the room for maneuver that I think we're beginning to understand better. And it's really very recently that this has emerged. Research on both sides of the Atlantic shows how susceptible our mainstream press has been to an alliance of big data, billionaire friends of Donald Trump, and the disparate forces of the Leave campaign in both the US elections and the Brexit referendum, and how fear-mongering over immigration and over Islam, targeting different parts of the population with their radical right messaging, was successfully fomented on a major scale by some of the most sophisticated communicators of our era. What are these people up to, we might ask? As has been pointed out, much of the political content of Brexit demands, ethnicized nationalism, economic protection, is in flat contradiction to their political outlook. They are globalists through and through. Take Aaron Banks, the insurance millionaire who funded Leave EU, who describes his as a very simple agenda to destroy the professional politician. The politics of continuing referendums and recalls that they advocate aims at stalling action by elected politicians and public service professionals alike, as they put it, draining the swamp to leave the way clear for a new kind of nihilistic governmentality, where the ebb and flow of mood and opinion in big data can be surfed and any useful wave amplified and capitalized upon. This is a kind of hyper-political anti-politics in which politics is reduced to perpetual theatre. For these people, Brexit will make it easier to remove legal and political obstacles to the establishment of this new regime through an increase in the power of those who own the data to win support. The anti-politics I'm talking about is predicated on one key assumption about the relationship between people and knowledge, that in this digitalized world, the people do not need to know and understand about their own conditions of existence, as they are the thing to be known about and manipulated accordingly. If this is the enemy, then a politics dedicated to what people, as agents of their own fate, can make possible together, overcoming the barriers of fear-mongering and hatred, is what I believe DiEM25, ably led by that generator of political alternatives, Yanis Varoufakis, wishes to serve. So I'm here to ask, can the Brexit rebuff to the mainstream political agenda in Britain and Europe be turned into an opening for the transformation that we all so urgently need? We in DiEM25 are really glad that recommendations for a substantial transitional post-Brexit referendum period, backed by our movement's entire membership from London to Warsaw, have been embraced by key players in Britain's political class, starting with Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party. But can't we take this new opportunity for adequate democratic process and scrutiny far further to generate European alternatives and the experience of democracy in action? The UK must play a key role in the open-sourced, democratic, transparent, and radical transformation that Europe needs. Will we succeed? I'm not sure, but I am sure that what is possible, including maybe a referendum on a transformed UK, rejoining a transformed democratic EU, will only come about if we are in this fight together. Thank you.
Rosemary Bechler, thank you so much. We are in this together. A man who knows everything about European alternatives, Lorenzo Marsili.
Thank you. Very rapidly, I know it's... thank you. Very rapidly, I know it's very late. I want to make a very simple point. I'm really tired of having to choose between the status quo or going back into the past. I think we need to reclaim our capacity and our will to conquer the future. Thank you. I had my political come of age at the time of one of the largest global movements of the last decades, probably, in the first years of the 2000s. From Seattle to Mumbai, we were filling the squares of the world over, saying that another world is possible. I was 17 when in Genoa we were charged by the police while screaming that we needed a new economic deal, then neoliberal globalization, a new deal for migration, then the criminalization of refugees and anybody helping them, a new ecological deal, then a system that is as unsustainable as doomed to blowing up our planet if it is to continue. And this movement was criminalized, repressed, and ignored. Today we see the very same issues re-emerging over and over again across all the globe. This is why I really have a problem when Theresa May, to respond also to what Rosemary was saying, Theresa May recently made this statement. She said, anybody who considers themselves a citizen of the world is really a citizen of nowhere. And what she meant, of course, is that UKIP was right. We have to be nationalist if we want to recuperate our political agency. She was terribly wrong and at the same time correct if we misread what she said. In today's world, we have such a level of interconnectivity with one another, such a level of interdependency as the climate movement has demonstrated, that we're all, to a certain extent, citizens of the world. But our incapacity of constructing political structures, a political agency at a level that goes beyond that of the nation state is indeed transforming us into denizens, into citizens of nowhere, into half citizens who lack a political agency to influence and shape their future. And what is the future that we need to recuperate? It's all the great issues that will define the next years to come and that our countries are increasingly incapable, unable, and unwilling to address. Think of technology. You have two choices in front of you. You can decide to go with the Silicon Valley and have your data monetized by the big five monopoly capitalist corporations in California, and then have your data captured and sold to the National Security Agency in Washington. Or if you want an alternative, you can go with the Chinese platforms. You can decide to use Tencent, you can decide to use Alibaba instead of Amazon and have those monetize your data. And instead of the NSA, it would be the Chinese Communist Party to have political control over your interaction. We think we need and can do better. We need an alternative that is neither the Silicon Valley nor the Great Firewall of China. Take again... Take another gigantic question that you will know only too well, that of multinational tax evasion. What is the alternative that they want to sell to you? Either we accept the system where multinationals pile up hundreds of tax-evaded billions into offshore fiscal paradises, 5 of which are in the European Union, 1 of which was constructed by the current president of the European Commission, Jean-Claude Juncker, or what we... Or the alternative is that we turn our own countries into fiscal heavens in order to beggar thy neighbor, to try and steal a little bit of tax revenue from other European countries and bring them into our countries. You need to find your niche market. Ireland is doing it with technology corporations. The Netherlands does it very well with your toothpaste, with Procter & Gamble. Luxembourg does it splendidly with your furniture. IKEA paying 5% in Luxembourg. Portugal, they have the sun, so they're doing it with pensioners. You can move to Portugal and your pension will not be taxed. So your country will use also the tax income coming from that. But again, we need to refuse that the only alternative is between accepting fiscal paradises or turning our countries into fiscal paradises. And the time is very short. Anyone here can continue and extend this list. We can speak about globalization and the scandal of multinational corporations that exploit the world's workforce and pollute the world's rivers. But then the alternative that we're offered is that of building protectionist walls. And again, neither nor. So what is Europe the name of? What should Europe be the name of? Europe should be the name of the neither nor. Neither the alternative of a failed, unjust, bankrupt present, nor the alternative of a return to a past of nationalism, of xenophobia, of walls, borders, and authoritarianism that is as old as anything can possibly become. Of course, the Europe that we have today, the state of the Europe today, is very far from being the Europe that we want to see, the Europe of the neither nor. And that's where we come in. We are neither for this state of the Europe nor for the disintegration of this Europe, but for its radical transformation from the bottom up. And who are we? You see DiEM all around this stage, but we are the thousands of women who are protesting against the criminalization of abortion in Poland. We are the thousands of people who in Hungary are protesting against the fascist regime of EPP member Viktor Orbán. We are the thousands of people who in Spain are conquering city after city to show that a different way of running your city from that of the neoliberal corporations and corrupt politicians of the past exists. We are the thousands of people who in the south of Italy are welcoming migrants, are saving migrants at sea against the criminalization of their state and against the complete subservience of the European Union to the fascist, authoritarian, xenophobic logic. We are the millions of people who signed to say that TTIP and CETA have to be consigned to the dustbin of history. We are the millions of people who said that water is a common good and has to be placed out of the market. And once again, everybody can continue this list as much as you want. The point to close on is that the time has come to transform this other Europe, these thousands and millions of people that exist all across our continent, this other Europe that exists in itself, to transform it into another Europe that exists for itself, that is conscious of its presence, is conscious of its power, and has the capacity and the will to transform this continent bottom up. This calls for a powerful pan-European political movement. It calls for a gigantic work of education, and perhaps, come 2019, it might also call to send some people a few hundred meters from here to actually do what needs to be done and hasn't been done so far.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Thank you, Lorenzo. This other Europe, conscious of its presence and power, that is us. That is us. Thank you so much for this. In the meantime, we can see that people here are awake, conscious, curious, critical, and constructive all the time. DiEM Voice is with us in the background, yet we're skipping the Q&A that was on the program now because it's running late. So the final thing we're going to do now, following up on both of you, and please stay on stage, is 4 last calls to action, each 1 minute by people you've seen tonight. And can I ask Alice Marie Higgins first to join us, and Yanis Varoufakis too.
Thank you. So a call to action. First, I think we need to have the courage and the imagination to not only reform but transform the European institutions and structures and the way we work together as European citizens. And we've heard a range of small and big ideas what that is, be it a European Parliament that can initiate legislation, be it an economy and trade policies that are answerable to citizens, be it new kinds of mandates and new kinds of accountability. But as well as all these ideas, we also need to challenge, in whichever form it takes, the rise in inequality, in exclusion, and the return of old hierarchies. Because it's very important that we have a Europe which is radically inclusive, which is radically equal, and which has an economy and a politics that is alive with people and with the issues that matter to people, like care, like decent work, the issues which have been left to the fringes as the fallout from the economy, now to be placed as the drivers of how we shape our policy. But fundamentally, I think we need to appreciate what an extraordinary and precious thing it is, after centuries of war, authoritarianism, and colonialism, to even have a group of diverse nations who want to try to live in peace and work together in peace for a better future. And the reason we need to show that that can work, all of these diverse nations, not simply a narrowing down of new hierarchies. The reason we need to make it work is because the big global challenges we face, like climate change, like the Sustainable Development Goals, can only be achieved if we prove that diverse nations can work together for common purpose. And that is essentially the challenge that we have. If we, as Europeans, can shape a better Europe, then we can also help shape what it means to be human on the only known planet with life. This is a real and meaningful opportunity for us, and it's one I hope we can step forward into together. Thank you.
Rosemary Higgins, thank you so much. Yanis Varoufakis.
When I was at the Eurogroup, they said that I gave them hell. It's not true. I just told the truth, to paraphrase Harry Truman, and they thought it was hell. Tonight, what we did, we spoke the truth to shake Europe gently but firmly. I want to finish with a call. Let's all leave this theater with a shared dream that a progressive, democratic, Europeanist, European New Deal agenda, like the one that we discussed today, is going to find an opportunity to be presented as a real alternative to the peoples of Europe in a ballot box near everyone by 2019. This is a discussion that we are having within DiEM25, and it is a decision that we're going to reach in the next few weeks of how we're going to do this by 2019. Join this discussion by joining DiEM25. Thank you. Now, in the spirit of horizontality, as we say in DiEM25, I want to invite Eric Edman, the coordinator of the Spontaneous Collective of Brussels, DiEM25, to wrap up the event tonight. He is the person that put the most amount of work in it. I think we need to hear the final call to action from somebody who has been so magnificently active to bring us all together here. Thank you for wasting your Saturday night on us. I believe in constructive waste in the same way that DiEM25 believes in constructive disobedience. Mr. Edman.
Thank you. Yanis is too kind. He's too kind. I wish I could take credit for this incredible event, for which I am extremely proud, but it's very difficult to do with all the people who actually deserve it looking at me from all over this theater, so I can't. Thank you to the Beaux-Arts, thank you to Jonas Dahl for bringing this incredible stage with us here today, but more importantly, thank you to Joran and Francis and Claire and Niels and David and all our volunteers, the DiEM members, the real people with a dream and an ambition for Europe and the willingness to spend a scary amount of hours to make that vision happen. They are the people that got us here today, and they are the ones that, I know you've been applauding all day, but they deserve the biggest round of applause of the night. So to our volunteers. One last word. Thank you. One last word. Ideas remain ideas until somebody implements them. And the same will happen with these visions that we heard here today for a progressive, ambitious, and active Europe that comes from our citizens. They will stay within these glorious walls unless we take them with us out of here, into the streets, into our workplaces, into our families, and share them with our friends, and stand for the Europe that we want to have, for the Europe that makes us proud to be a part of. So, we here in Brussels, as soon as we're done recuperating, at least partially, from organizing this event, we're back in action. On the 27th of September, we start our ambitious program of taking the ideas of the real State of the Union, which is more than an event, it's a reality, and we start discussing them seriously with our first event, titled with a very simple question: why do European parties not exist? And that will happen at the Moonpunt Grand Cafe on the 27th of September, and it starts our program towards the Europe that DiEM is trying to achieve. And I hope to have you all there. Thank you for coming here tonight, Brussels. It's not adieu, it's au revoir. Carpe diem.